Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the globe you're at. This is Payment System Broadcast, session 24. The name of today is Tackling Public Sector Fraud, Insights from the PSFA Annual Report 2023-2024. We're going to leave a couple of seconds for people to join. We're going to start shortly. Okay, I think we can start. So once again, welcome back to the Payment System Broadcast, the 24th. Today we're going to have two distinguished speakers. First, we have Mark Cheeseman, CEO of the UK's Public Sector Fraud Authority, or PSFA, here to share insights from their second annual report, 2023-2024, which was published back in July 17, 2025. And we're also having Phillip Straley, president of FNA, who is, you can see from the background, is live from Cybos 2025 in Frankfurt, who will provide a global perspective of what is FNA doing on this on the sector of fraud and scams in the private sector, especially with central banks and financial authorities worldwide. As you can see, there is some differences, but there are some intersection points here. Mark is going to talk about public sector fraud. Philip is going to talk about fraud and scams in private sector, especially in the retail payments. So the focus today is on how governments and financial institutions can move from reactive detection to proactive prevention, how they can work on building systems, culture, and collaboration that will reduce the incidence and the impact of fraud before losses occur. Obviously, also to have some lessons about how to manage fraud and scams after they have occurred as well. So the idea today is to have some cross-fertilization about what the public and the private sector they're doing. That's our main point for today. And let's start. So first things first, do the speakers have any disclaimers?
Not for me.
None for me, Carlos.
Okay, that's fine. So let's start with our first question. So Mark, could you please explain what the Public Sector Fraud Authority does and where you have seen the greatest progress since the authority's launch in 2022, which is a rather new authority?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak as part of this. It's greatly appreciated. So the Public Sector Fraud Authority, as you said, was introduced in 2022, and it's really built off the learnings that the UK government had during the COVID pandemic of how to manage fraud across the system. And it was introduced to work with public bodies and government departments to better understand and reduce the impact of fraud against the public sector. In thinking about what the PSFA does, I think the first important thing to do is to step back and think about the UK public sector. So the UK public sector, central government, is quite a big, complex organisation. So it has a lot of different organisations as part of it. There are two in the centre. There's the Cabinet Office and Treasury, which the Public Sector Fraud Authority reports to, both of those. But then there are another 20-odd government departments and then hundreds of arm's length bodies and other parts of government delivering the system. So actually, in supporting and working with public bodies and departments, part of the challenge there is to work across that system, because there's lots of things that go on across that system. So our first thing we do to understand that is, rather than working in an individual area, it's work across the whole system. Because fraudsters don't often see, oh, I'm going to defraud this public body or that public body. They defraud government, right? Or they defraud something. And often, some of the evidence suggests to us that they might defraud multiple things at one time as well. So how can we create a cross-system approach? I'll say a bit more about what the Public Sector Fraud Authority does later, but really it breaks down to three things. We work with government departments by building a structure to agree what their focuses should be. and how they should impact. So one of the things, and in answering the second part of the question, where's the greatest progress, is a real resolute focus on outcomes. One of the things referenced in the annual report is the framework going in for us to agree targets with public bodies for the outcomes they'll have when dealing with fraud. Why is that? Well, that's because fundamentally fraud is a financial crime, right? That when we lose money through it, we lose money. So therefore, those of us who are working to combat that should challenge ourselves to show our value in the currency that those who are attacking the system are doing by how we're preventing that. So we agree that and the minimum standards that should be in place across government, and then monitor public bodies to do that. The second thing we do is then working that very cross-system perspective. There's lots of things that you can do better across a system than in several hundred or over 200 silos. So we run data analytics. Another great success in the report, it references the 373 million we achieved in that financial year. Government has just announced last financial year's impact, which was 484 million in prevented and recovered fraud and error. And that's through running cross-system analytics that brings data together from all those different public bodies and then shares with them where some of those challenges and risks and things may be. I'm happy to dig into what some of those areas are. But it's not just about data and analytics. We also do work to understand risk, which we'll talk about later, and really providing support and services into public bodies to help them with the change, because government is asking public bodies to do more. So the PSFA, as well as setting the framework for that in the targets and the outcomes, also supports public bodies in going through that. The final way that we work is through building capability in the system. So in my experience, fraud and financial crime management is a massively under-structured area in how we build capabilities systematically to deal with it. Many people of my generation who work in counter-fraud roles kind of slipped into them. We were doing something else and then we were offered a fraud role and we did the fraud role and now we work in fraud. And that's not what we do with our legal professions or our accountancy professions or things like that. So one of the things that we do at the centre of the UK government through the Public Sector Fraud Authority is we have the world's first and only counter-fraud profession, which is a professional structure with qualifications. So we can systematically build capability, both in the established areas like investigation and intelligence management, but also in those new areas people need to use more, like risk, prevention, leadership, culture change. So we can catalogue or systematize the learning and the experience that is currently being used, and then train and qualify people to that level so they can then go further and we can get better and better. So we build that structure to build capability across the public sector and with our public bodies and departments.
Thank you, Mark. That was a great explanation, and I already have identified several intersections with what we do at FNA regarding fraud and scams. But I think that I will let Phillip start, and perhaps I can wrap it up a bit about these ideas. Phillip, I would say that my question would be like, what do you see like the connection of what Mark just has presented with what we do, or the central banks and financial authorities do when they are dealing with fraud and fraud risk?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that, Carlos. And from my perspective, thanks very much as well, Mark, for joining us today. I think despite the fact that we're talking about very different topics under the umbrella of fraud, so Mark and his agency and the various public sector bodies in the UK are focused on deep aspects of defrauding public bodies, the myriad public bodies in the UK. What we're focused on is a different problem around consumer fraud and scams in particular. So authorized push payment fraud. So romance scams, investment scams, etc., pig butchering. Everybody's heard about. These are examples of these in pretty much every country in the world, and particularly in those countries where there has been very rapid take up of instant or faster payment systems, which makes it much easier for the fraudsters or criminals to launder the money and get it out of the financial system very quickly, we are seeing authorized push payment fraud skyrocketing. That's the case in Asia, it's the case in the Middle East, it's the case across Europe and the UK, it's the case to a bit lesser extent in North America, though it's rising, and lesser extent in North America because faster payment systems are at an earlier stage in the US and Canada. Now, obviously, these types of scams, they're not impacting the government directly, but they're impacting the government indirectly through the impact on individuals' lives. So, in many cases, individuals are being defrauded out of their life savings. Obviously, when this happens, these become political issues at a societal level, and like in the public sector space, a whole society approach is critical. So when I talk about whole society approach, it's the banks, it's the payment system operators, the e-wallet providers, national law enforcement, the financial intelligence units in the various countries, and no one individual organization is equipped with the data, the insight, the analytics to be able to solve this. So a national scale collaboration model is absolutely critical. So I think that's the first commonality between what we're doing at FNA and many other providers are doing, and what Mark talked about from a public sector perspective. I think we'll dig into it a bit more. I think the other commonalities that I'd call out very quickly are the importance of not just shared approaches, policies, collaboration frameworks, but also shared technology, specifically network analytics technology, which I'm sure Mark will talk about later. And then the third commonality as well is obviously when we're talking about very sensitive data, whether that's consumer data or whether that's sensitive public sector data, it's very important that the technology and data architectures are put together in a way so that you achieve the privacy and national sovereignty objectives that are needed. So I'll stop there and pass back to you, Carlos.
Thank you, Philip. I think that you have highlighted more or less the same points that I was going to highlight, but perhaps I will add something, which is the second point that Mark mentioned, which is the cross-system perspective. Instead of working on silos, that's something that we have seen a lot in FNA when dealing with fraud and scams. And at the end, the idea of centralizing but sharing the analytics, the data, the support, the services is the way forward. Because we know that in the case of, let's say, retail payments, fraud and scams, each bank or each payment system can have great know your client, great behavioral monitoring of the people, but if they're not able to see where the money is going, if they're not able to see where the mule accounts are, there is no way of fighting in an efficient manner fraud and scams and recovering the money. Because at the end, one of the points which is, I would say, is like the ultimate form of consumer protection is giving the money back to the people who were affected. And from what Mark will talk, I think, a little bit later, and what I read from the public sector fraud authority report is that getting the money back, it's also one of the important parts of the task. I mean, saving money to the taxpayer. So I would say, I would like to highlight that this, I mean, perhaps for me, the most important commonality is that this is like pointing out that having national utilities for critical public goods, such as combating fraud and scams, is the way forward. Those national utilities are more efficient than siloed or individual efforts. So that's my point here, or my 2 cents here. So let's go to the second question, Mark. How is PSFA working with public and private sector to make sure fraud is acted on quickly and consistently?
And I think there's 4 things I'd probably highlight in that, and then I may touch on the private sector angle a little bit. So the first is we've got to recognize, and we mentioned this in the report, that fraud is a hidden crime, right? Those who are committing fraud are actively trying to hide it. And those who are good at committing fraud are actually pretty good at hiding it. So I think the first thing we do to try and make sure that we are acting quickly and consistently is draw that out of the shadows, draw that out of the hiding place, talk about fraud, shift the culture. So we talk in the public sector about how finding fraud is a good thing. There's a risk you can have a culture where we see any fraud attack is a failure on the part of the organization where the fraud attack happened, which actually doesn't take into account the fact that we have a capable and committed adversary who is trying to get things, trying to attack systems. So the first thing is to draw it out, bring fraud to attention, and kind of make it acceptable and positive that we're finding it and that we're looking for it, and that's the right thing to do, and that finding it isn't a sign of failure. Finding it is a sign of success of a good and healthy system. The second thing we do, and again, this comes to the cross-system part that you've both been reflecting on, is that one of the things we can do in working across government is bring all those organizations together. Because actually, we said this just now, and Philip, I think you said it, that we can't deal with fraud by ourselves. Like, you need, there's no solution which is just us. There are solutions which involve other organizations coming together, and that's just the same in the public sector and with our private sector partners. We need to bring in. So one of the things that we really do is we act as the bridge to bring organizations together, to create communities of practice, to create spaces where we're helping organizations and public bodies to look out, rather than the risk when you feel like you've had a fraud is that you look in, you become introverted. What have we done wrong? But actually, how can the system help us to fix it and get better and stronger? So we build those bridges. The third is a structural thing. So again, in the annual report, it references that we've built something called the high-risk portfolio across government. And what that does is that highlights where the main risks are, the biggest risk programs are. And again, that's kind of about getting ahead. That's about saying, look, well, there's a lot. Public sector is a big space. I talked about all those public bodies. Where are the places where we're really going to focus in on and really bring to the attention? So if things happen, we can act more quickly. And we can get ahead and we can put in that preventative capability that I think we're going to talk about a bit later. And the final thing, and you're going to get my hobby horse here because you've already had like a 5-minute spiel about this. The final thing we do to try and make sure fraud is acted on quickly and consistently is build capability. From my own experience, it's very different having a fraud issue land on your desk if you are new to the fraud space and don't really know how it works than it is if you are fully capable, firing on all cylinders, have all the connections, know all the legislation, know all the processes, know the best practice, know where to go and get the best practice. So I'm coming back to that hobby horse, but structurally building capability in the system. So where fraud happens, there is capability that can act on it and can act on it quickly and in a way that it draws on the best practice across such a big system as the public sector in the UK. That's another way that we're doing that.
Thank you, Mark. Philip, central banks and other financial authorities are also working on how to implement an efficient and consistent approach to detecting and managing fraud in retail payment systems. How do you see this balance playing out in the practice across different jurisdictions?
Thanks, Carlos. Great question. Before I answer that question, I actually wanted to call out something that that Mark said that I think is very important to flag. He said a number of great things, interesting things, but he used the term, we have very capable and committed adversaries. And I think that that's something that we should flag here. I think it's something that's very important. Also in the consumer fraud space, we're not talking about fraudsters who are acting alone in most cases, who are sitting in their bedroom. You know, in most cases, we're talking about very, very well organized crime run syndicates, many of them, but, you know, not all of them, but, you know, many of them in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands and elsewhere. And I think it's also important that they are very well technology and now AI enabled with things like chat GPT, deep fakes, et cetera. And this is impacting both the consumer space as well as the commercial and public sector spaces. So we have very capable and committed adversaries who are also enabled by technology And so we need to, fight AI with AI would be one thing I would say. On your question around, kind of how we see this playing out across jurisdictions around the world, we see a huge amount of diversity in terms of approaches. I think we'll talk a little bit later about the fact that in many countries around the world, we're seeing dedicated national level anti-scam utilities being adopted. We're seeing this. It started really about 4 or 5 years ago, and now it's really sweeping much of the globe now. But I think that we need to recognize also that each jurisdiction around the world is unique. They're unique in terms of the motifs of fraud. They're unique in terms of, how scammed funds exit the system, whether that's principally via ATMs or online purchases, or increasingly in some countries into crypto. Countries are also unique from the perspective of the types of data privacy rules that are in place, with some allowing much broader sharing, for instance, of consumer data across banks in the case of there being a financial crime, including a scam. There are also differences in terms of who wears the liability, whether it's the consumer wearing the liability, or whether it is, in many jurisdictions, the UK included increasingly the sending and receiving bank in an APP fraud. And so we need to recognize that because each jurisdiction is unique, the priorities are going to differ. The implementation timelines for these national level approaches will differ. The ownership models for building and operating infrastructure will differ. And at the very top level, the national cultures are different in each jurisdiction in terms of the typical roles and responsibilities, whether, for instance, the public sector tends to be more directive in certain countries versus leaving it up to the private sector to find a solution. And on that point, there's not necessarily a right answer. But one final point that I'd make before I'll stop is that, we are seeing that countries that are more directive, where the public sector is playing a rapid driving role, can move more quickly than other countries that just kind of leave it up to the market participants.
That's great. Thank you, Philip. And thank you, Mark. I think that the last part that Philip mentioned about having like some degree of organization or some degree of coordination is one of the things that we have seen a lot in several jurisdictions which are becoming rapidly successful. And I think that overlaps with what PSFA is doing, because at the end it's a coordination body for the government, but it's a coordination body at the end. I mean, it's trying to make all the efforts to centralize and share, as we already mentioned, the analytics, the data, the support, the services, the capability building. So I think that's a good intersection in between both public and private sector efforts against fraud and scams. And I'm going to go very quickly into perhaps one of the things that at FNA we like the most. And you, perhaps, for those that do not know, FNA stands for Financial Network Analytics. So we love networks. So we work a lot on networks. So right now I'm going to start talking, or we're going to start talking about methodologies. And what we have learned from PSFA report is that the PSFA has built and deployed something which is called the Single Network Analytics Platform, which is described as an integral tool for uncovering hidden connections between companies and individuals. And that phrase is something that we had at FNA for a long time as a part of the description of what we do. So we feel like a lot of connection with the PSFA in that respect. Mark, can you describe what this SNAP, or Single Network Analytics Platform, does and how it strengthens the detection and recovery while maintaining public trust?
Yeah, of course. So the first thing to think is that the Single Network Analytics Platform is one of a suite of data analytics tools that we operate, right? And those are the things that cause those financial benefits, or the source of those financial benefits that I talked about earlier. But talking about what the single network analytics platform does, well, what it does is it draws together lots of different data sets from around government and draws them together quickly. So a process that would previously have taken a long time to do, it can do, I don't know if they called it Snap and because of this, but it can do it like that. It can just bring that data together. And then what it does is it matches that data across each other. It networks it. It looks for the connections. It looks for the connections between different things and other things, which could lead into a broader piece. And what that does for us is that one highlights areas where, hang on a minute, does this entity in the system, is there something here that we didn't know about? Does it have a link to something we didn't know about in the system, which can be looked at? But also in terms of our counter fraud work, what it enables the investigators to do is it enables activity that would have taken a long time to do, they can do quickly, because it can deal with, as technology can, it can deal with mass amounts of data in one go, which would take an individual a long time to go through and then draw out and would they see this thing? Would they remember that it was this phone number or this address that was linked to that address? And the Snap just does that. It does all that networking. It draws diagrams of how that's networked together and shows it and brings in, core data to us, core data that we use for assurance and compliance and to understand the entities that we do business with. So that's what it does. It also then does it under, you asked about privacy and public trust. Well, it's really important we do that. It's really important that matching is in line with legislation, is in line with the GDPR legislation, is in line with the legislation we have that allows us to do data matching and the purposes it can be used for, is aligned with the individual organizations we work with and their legislation. So right at the heart of it, it has that trust about the data is only used in the way the legislation sets out that it can be used and is only shared where the legislation enables it to be shared. And that's built into the structure of the thing itself. But I mean, just to take it Snap as an example, but Philip's absolutely right. This is a modern volume crime, and our adversaries are using these tools and techniques. In defending against them, we have to use these tools and techniques. And I firmly believe with the volume issue that we have, the only way to deal with the volume issue is to use a volume tool like data and analytics to deal with it. You can't deal with it in the old-fashioned way of a one-to-one basis of every allegation you get in through whistleblowing you deal with. Obviously, one would deal with the whistleblowing allegation. My point is we need to do more than that. We need to try and get into the volume through using these tools and techniques.
That's great, Mark. And I think that unfortunately, I'm the moderator and not the speaker. So I'm going to allow Philip to give his perspective from the side of central banks and payment system operators about how they tackle scams and fraud with different methodologies, including vector analytics. And then I'm going to add something very briefly. Philip.
Okay. So, I mean, maybe I'll just mention a couple of things that I think are particularly relevant, building on what Mark just said, specifically applications of network analytics. So there are maybe 3 applications of network analytics that I would call out that are very important in the consumer scam and fraud space. So the first, and probably the one that gets the most press because it is maybe a bit sexier, is kind of real-time pre-transaction scoring. So using network analytics, or what we term graph AI, graph artificial intelligence type approaches, where before a faster payment transaction is made, in addition to things like verification of payee, so this is the person that you intend to be paying and not somebody else, that also the individual and or the financial institution that an individual is banking with will receive, sub-second, so 5, 10, 20 milliseconds, a risk score which is driven not just off that financial institution's data, but shared data from all transactions across the entire payments network in a country. So I think this is one very powerful, interesting application of network science and network analytics. A second, which is maybe a bit less sexy, but I think equally important, is using network or graph analytics for the tracking and tracing in real time of ill-gotten funds, whether that's by a authorized push payment or a scam or another type of fraud, such that in real time, financial institutions, law enforcement at a national level, and financial intelligence units like the National Crime Authority in Crime Agency in the UK can see where the money is in real time across many different payment systems. So across a faster payment system, the QR payment system, ATM transactions, crypto exits, etc. And this has real world effects. So one example that we can talk about, because it's they've made it public, is the Malaysian National Scam Response Center has this in production now, real-time track and trace across more than 20 different payment rails and data sources. And the impact of this has been that once there has been a scam, out of scam funds before the national level approaches and before national level technology was in place, they were clawing back about 50 cents out of every, about half of 1% of scammed funds. So if you had $100 scammed on average, they were getting back about 50 cents. Now they're getting back between 25 and $30. So effectively a 50 to 60x increase in the money that is going back to those scam victims. So I'll stop there. Maybe you have something to add, Carlos?
Yes, Philip. I would say that there are several overlaps in what we do regarding networks. And I would say that perhaps the most important one is to highlight that this is a systemic problem. This is a problem that cannot be solved by each bank or each payment system or each governmental institution alone. This is something that has to be solved in a systemic way. And the only way for someone to see the system is with networks. So that's perhaps the main message. If you don't deal with these problems from a network approach, you're missing a lot. And the detection and the management and the recovery is not going to be that efficient. So let's go to the next question. So Mark, the annual report 2023-2024 emphasizing about bringing expertise in earlier to design fraud out of programs before money is lost. Could you share an example of how that's working in practice?
Absolutely. And I'm going to jump back on my hobby horse to start, because how does that work in practice? Well, in practice, to start, you need to build the capability to design fraud out, right? You can't just say, right, we will design fraud out. You need to understand the skills, knowledge, and experience that it takes for brilliant people to do that, and then try and spread that around your system and actively build it. So the UK government has the only standard for fraud risk assessment, how it should be done, and it has a stand on how it should be done, what it should look like. It's consistent across the UK government and how that's done. It then has professional standards on measurement and prevention and the things that people should be thinking about in terms of doing that. And we have, you see in the annual report, we have been training through the PSFA people in those standards. And that is a key part. We ask about how does it look like in practice, getting early designing out fraud? Well, it looks like getting trained, capable people into the programs really early to understand the risks and to work with those programs as they design those programs to say, if we do it this way, this fraud risk will increase, or this challenge will happen. So we build that capability. We then do other things. So I said the other mention about the Public Sector Fraud Authority is we do some cross-system monitoring. So for instance, we look at the quality of the fraud risk assessments in the system, where they're being done, where they're not. I talked about the high-risk portfolio of those highest risk areas in the government. When we look at them, one of the things we look at, do they have a fraud risk assessment? Is it of quality? Is it driving the designing out? Because fundamentally, that's what drives good design, is really understanding how you'll be attacked and understanding that in the detail. And another thing we often say is fraud is committed in the detail, so it has to be fought in the detail. It's the nuances and the chinks that fraudsters find to then push through and scale. So you need to understand those chinks. And you need to understand that in the detail, because then your prevention methodology will be at the chink in the armor that they're using. And there's a couple of schemes you could look at where this has happened. So recently the Infected Blood Compensation Authority and the schemes running through that, fraud risk expertise was put in up front as that was being designed to try and limit the risk of fraud against that. The same with the energy schemes that were done by our government when energy prices significantly increased. Though fraud risk expertise was put in from the PSFA actually in its early days, was put into those schemes to really understand the details of the risks and then shape the design of those schemes. And where the scheme had to be designed in a certain way to deliver the outcomes, the policy outcomes the government needed, then to think of what prevention activity could happen. But also, there's a bit of a misnomer when we say design fraud out of programs, because we can be tempted into thinking we can design fraud out of programs. We cannot. We can design programs to make them more robust. We can design programs to limit the risk, but there'll always be chinks that can be attacked. So part of designing fraud out of programs and making them more resilient is recognizing that and then building detection frameworks with where we've just been, data and analytics, network analytics, pieces like that, to pick up on those risks that actually we don't think we can design out.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. Philip, before I give the next question, I would like to add something to what Mark said, and it's about in retail payments. We know that it's impossible to have a perfect know your client and a perfect detection of fraud. So all in all, it's necessary to have good management, and where we have seen at FNA when we have discussed with several central banks and other providers of technology for fraud and scams prevention, is that prevention is not enough. Because in scams, for instance, as there is social engineering and AI behind, as Philip already highlighted, it's impossible to have perfect ways of preventing or detecting those scams happening. So to the point that Philip already made as well, is we need to have good management tools. Tools to recover the money, to freeze accounts, and so on and so forth. So that has also a lot to do with what Mark was mentioning about how to work in practice to design those frauds, how to design the systems to prevent fraud, and how to manage those fraud, because detection is never going to be perfect. Going forward to the next question, unless Philip wants to add something to that.
No, I mean, maybe kind of before we do that, maybe would also again call out a nice quote from Mark, and then commented on it. Here I'm paraphrasing, but Mark said something along the lines of, criminals, who are smart, they're looking for chinks in the armor. They're looking for vulnerabilities. They're constantly testing and probing for vulnerabilities. We see exactly the same thing in the consumer fraud space. They're looking for, members of society, or types of members of society who are more vulnerable to certain types of social engineering. They're looking also for, which banks or which e-wallets or payment system providers are, have weaker controls as well. As Mark was probably talking about, they're probing for, different public sector bodies, perhaps that have not, brought their controls and risk management up to the same level as some of the others. We see the same thing with criminals testing. I want to go after consumers in bank X or bank Y because they know that their risk controls are not as strong. And even across countries, because these are transnational organized crime syndicates, they're looking for countries that have not put in place the necessary cross sector national controls as well. So, these transnational crime organizations, if they start being less successful in, Malaysia, they're probably going to go to Indonesia. And if, Indonesia puts in stronger controls, they're going to go to Thailand, for instance. And I'm just calling those out as as examples as well. So they're constantly looking for those chinks in the armor, as Mark said.
That's true. And the people who follow the FNA broadcast know that I love complex systems terms. So we should be treating criminals, fraudsters, and scammers as adaptive agents. So that's the whole point of having like these ever evolving methods to detect and to manage the fraud. So Philip, about that, many jurisdictions have implemented or are considering what we have already mentioned as national anti-scam utilities, which integrate prevention and case management, which is the point that we were discussing a couple of seconds ago. What are the lessons to be shared from these experiences? You already mentioned some things, but I wonder if we have a little bit more to tell.
Yeah. I mean, I'll try to be very quick because I'm looking at the clock now. So you're very right that we are seeing a huge groundswell of an increasing number of countries setting up national anti-scam utilities. This is particularly in Asia. It's kind of in Asia Pacific. It started in Asia Pacific, and it's kind of moving out of Asia Pacific into many other jurisdictions, which is fantastic. I guess the couple of points that I'd call out in terms of lesson learned are that, to the point that I was making earlier, prioritization, whether that is prioritization of prevention or prioritization of clawback of funds that's already been scammed, I think that really needs to be fit to the local environment and the local situation, and balance both the financial institution, the victims, and the public sector needs. The second point that I'd raise is that all of the key stakeholders need to be brought into the tent. So this is the central bank from a supervisory perspective, banks, e-wallets and payment system providers, the financial intelligence unit, national law enforcement, ideally telco operators, who can bring very important data, around where various attack vectors are coming from, et cetera. So all of these stakeholders need to be brought into the tent to fight this together. And then the third point that I'd raise in terms of lessons learned is that, while not necessarily required, a physical location with co-located individuals from across all of those stakeholders can be very helpful. And we're seeing that type of co-location in many countries around the world. We see that in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Saudi Arabia, as just a few examples.
That's great. And thank you, Philip, for reminding me about the time. I'm aware of that, but the discussion has been so good that I'm happy to do it nice and slow. It has been very good. So let's go to the next one. Mark, the risk, threat, and prevention service help public bodies understand fraud risk across over 15 billion pounds of expenditure. How is this helping shift the government from reactive detection to proactive prevention?
Yeah, and the first step of that is what I've touched on before, which is it's about understanding that risk up front, using the standards that we have. What we do with the Risk, Threat and Prevention Service is the Public Sector Fraud Authority has a capability. We've developed people who are qualified to the standards, who are capable of doing that. And we help by going into those public bodies. So that 15 billion is we put people into those public bodies to help them understand that, to help them grapple with their risks. We put those specialists in. And that enables the shift because, my firm belief is that actually the best way to design the schemes and design things is by understanding that risk up front and then adapting the scheme design and the operation of that scheme to enable prevention to happen in it. So what we really do there is we put in that expert capability, provide it to the public bodies so they can understand things up front, which makes it a lot of this, like, dealing with fraud is quite difficult. I said already, fraud's in the detail, right? I mean, like any senior person will go, oh, my life, no, please don't be in the detail. That's the difficult bit to manage. But what this does is it tries to make it easier for the public bodies to manage fraud by giving them the capability that will grapple with that difficulty, grapple with that complexity, and really target in on the fraud risks. Then we can shape the scheme design around to make sure we're proactively preventing, rather than, there'll still be some we'll have to detect, but proactively prevent more rather than have to react to it all.
That's great, Mark. Philip, related to this, national authorities, including central banks, are increasingly looking at cross-sector anti-scam utilities, which we have already discussed a little bit. How do the prevention first lessons we've heard from PSFA translate into building this kind of shared fraud fighting frameworks across financial systems?
Right. Well, in spite of what I said earlier about, the fact that shared case management and track and trace tools, are in many cases, the first priority from a technology perspective, I agree, with Mark, that, that prevention is the first priority. It's the right approach. And in this case, despite the fact that, we come from the perspective of being a technology provider, technology isn't the starting point for that prevention. It can be very helpful, but the starting point needs to be education of individuals on scam motifs, warning signals they should look for, and providing individuals with information that can help them avoid being scammed in the first place. And this needs to be continuous because the motifs of the criminals, of the fraudsters, are changing day by day. So this education needs to be very high priority and needs to constantly adapt to what we're seeing in the threat environment. Tech can be very helpful. Technology can be very helpful in terms of more simpler things like verification of payee, things like using AI for flagging mule accounts or suspect accounts that haven't necessarily been reported scam or fraud or mule accounts yet, but are demonstrating those types of behavior in a network of transactions. And I mentioned pre-transaction scoring as well to be able to provide more information to the individual or the individual's financial institution about whether potentially a payment should be blocked.
That's great, Philip. We have 2 questions left, so I will try to be very brief, and I will ask you very kindly to be brief as well, so we can at least address one of the questions from the public. So, Mark, PSFA also plays a leading role in the International Public Sector Fraud Forum with Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. What is the aim of this forum, and what lessons have come out of the international collaboration? You're mute, I think, unless I am.
That was always going to happen, wasn't it? At some point. The aim of the forum is in the same way that the Public Sector Fraud Authority. One of the things it does to build the standards I talked about is it brings together expertise from all the different public bodies to come together and say, what's the best way of doing this? What's the best way of dealing with this issue? So for the fraud risk assessment standard, what's the best way of doing fraud risk assessment that's most impactful? What the Public Sector Fraud Forum does then is it brings together countries to do the same thing and to share those practices. And I had the great privilege of hosting the forum just last week. We had colleagues over here from the different administrations talking through our challenges. And what we do is we talk through our challenges and we talk through what we're doing. We talk through what's working. We talk through what's not. We talk through where we struggled with the challenges, and we talk through where we've had a chink of light, right, rather than the chinks of armor I was talking about earlier. And what we find from that is that our contexts are different, but our challenges are very similar. And actually, what we've had drawn great value out of that international collaboration is, for instance, understanding from other countries how they do things and then adapting that into how we do things. And that's gone even further, the forum. So if you Google International Public Sector Fraud Forum, what you will see is 9 different sets of guidance that say, here is our leading practice from across our group of countries about how you deal with these things. So in those, for instance, is a guide to managing fraud in public bodies, which starts, with very basic concepts and our common view on those basic concepts of how you do it. And one of those I've referred to, which is that there'll always be fraud. We can't design it out completely. We can't start from a zero-based game. We've got to start from the realistic point. There's also guidance in there in how you use AI. There's guidance in there in how you deal with fraud and emergency management situations, which governments have to deal with, and you have to spend money more quickly. So the aim of the forum is to share all those practices, but then from that produce guidance that our countries and other countries can then use. and go and use that to build. And it was all about, I'm coming back to my hobby horse, building capability, codifying what we know and what we know's worked, so others can then use that codification and then go further.
That's great, Mark. Philip, something very related to the last answer, which is about international collaboration, is we are all very aware of the cross-border transfers as one of the main channels that fraudsters and scammers use to evade authorities, along with cashing out and converting to crypto and some other ways. How far are we from cross-jurisdiction cooperation to counter fraud and scams?
We're not far, and indeed, we're actually already there in some senses, particularly in terms of human cooperation, human-to-human cooperation across national law enforcement and across financial institutions. We still have quite a way to go in terms of that technology enablement and data sharing across jurisdictions, but there are many both bilateral and multilateral agreements already in place that are, that are having real effects. And if we're looking at the consumer fraud space, this is absolutely critical because, usually the first or perhaps the first and second transaction or mule account payment that is made after a scam, generally those tend to be domestic. But sometimes the third or fourth or fifth is already going cross-border, or it's going into crypto, for instance. And so this is really, really critical that we get these types of bilateral arrangements in place and technology enablement, technology enable these. We're seeing this being very important because, the faster payment systems in many countries increasingly have bilateral links between them. So this is particularly dense in terms of these bilateral connects in Asia Pacific. But we're also starting to see multilateral fora like the Nexus organization in Southeast Asia that incorporates 4 or 5 of the ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations, plus India, Buna in the Middle East. So these types of cross-border payments and then cross-border collaboration on fraud will become more and more important. But back to the point that I made around there already being, some success cases. One that I'd point out, and I can't talk specifically about the countries because I'm not sure that it's public knowledge yet, but one ASEAN country, Southeast Asian country, had one of their largest recoveries back to a scam victim of several tens of millions of dollars that had already been transferred offshore. It had actually been transferred offshore to a country that has implemented real-time track and trace capability. And the money was found in a financial institution in that second country, was frozen, and was ultimately restituted back to the victim. So there's some glimmers of light, or I think you talked about chinks of light, Mark. So that's also very positive to see.
That's great, Philip. And just to mention that networks, each jurisdiction is a network, but all networks are connected to the network of the other jurisdiction. So at the end, it's a bigger network that we should be targeting. So final question, the end question, which is about the priorities you both see in your fields. What are those top priorities that you see coming in the next years? Very quickly. Mark.
Thanks. When I thought about this, it felt like a bit like picking my favorite child, because I'm so passionate about all the things that I've talked about the Public Sector Fraud Authority does and the UK government is doing to understand and fight fraud. How do you pick one of those which you think is the priority? And so my easy answer to that is the priority is to advance the agenda and do more. But let's dig into that a little bit more. I think part of the priority is to continue changing the expectations, continue embedding the understanding that finding fraud and looking for fraud is good, and that actually an impact and return on investment from doing fraud work is really what we should be seeking to understand and shape our businesses around, but that's public sector or private sector. And why is that the priority? Well, because fundamentally that's the priority, because that's how we're going to have more impact. We're going to have more impact by resolutely going after the hidden crime, by looking for it, by building a structure that makes us want to look for it and celebrate when we find it. But secondly, because that's what's going to enable us to have the biggest impact possible. And for us, that means taxpayers' money that we can stop going to those who are attacking the system and prevent through better scheme design, and instead reinvest into public services.
Philip.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that this is really just a summation of some of the points that we've already talked about. So I see the key priorities that I'd call out being establishment, to the extent that they're not already there, of national anti-scam infrastructures. Infrastructures both human, including co-location, technology enablement, and then all of the enabling policies and legislation around things like data sharing that is going to make this work well. I think the second point that I'd call out is integrating tech, but particularly AI, across the value chain. So in the scoring of scam incident reports that have come in the flagging of mule accounts, to enriching typologies of fraud, detecting real-time transaction anomalies. So back to the point of fighting AI with AI. So that would be my second. And then the third we were just talking about, so cementing cross-border collaboration, which is both human and tech-enabled. I think these three together will collectively give us the best odds of reducing the return on investment for the criminals, which ultimately, as Mark was talking about, that's the name of the game. Basically putting in disincentivization to go after these individuals or these public sector bodies in the case of Mark.
That's great, Mark and Philip. Thank you very much for all your contributions. I'm going to wrap it up very quickly. 4 important things: cross-system perspective, centralizing and sharing everything. And everything is data, analytics, support, services. Third point is capability building, which is the preferred topic of Mark, and I agree with that, and I know that Philip agrees as well. And finally, cross-jurisdiction efforts. And everything, all these 4 points that I'm doing, they may live or they may lie below us like a common umbrella, let's call it like this, or a common roof, which is national utilities. National utilities will make this efficient and easier to implement. So that's it. We have just 1 minute left, so I'm not going to be able to give you like the question from the public, but I'm going to tell you about it a little bit, which is something called Anti-Money Laundering Regulation Article 75, which is related to information sharing and the adoption of privacy-enhancing technologies. So there are a lot of questions about how this Article 75 and some others could make more difficult or easier, depends on which perspective you see about this Article 75, how this will make easier or more difficult to counter fraud and scams and so on. And I'm not going to give you or to pose the question because we have no time. But let me tell you that we're going to have next month in November, we're going to have a broadcast dedicated to Article 75. So this will help us to open the floor for one of our next broadcasts. So once again, this is the end of the FMI broadcast, Payment System Broadcast, session 24. Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you very much, Mark. I hope to see you real soon. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Thanks, James.